Today marks the last week of the exploration of the themes of covenant at the start of this year. However, there will be more opportunities to explore these themes as we go on. Our Bible reading for today, Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 15, is a few small verses in the middle of a great chapter explaining the role of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in our salvation. Hebrews is a letter where the author is unknown, and the intended audience is also unknown. However, the audience would have most likely been Jewish Christians, as a lot of the information about the history and religious practices of Israel is taken as given. A lot of this can be quite alien to us now, but as we look at this passage, there is such a richness which gets me truly excited. As we spend some time in this passage, three statements about Jesus appear. Christ is high priest, Christ's cleansing is greater, and Christ is the mediator. I encourage you to have a Bible in front of you so that you can read other passages mentioned as we take a look at this passage. Feel free to pause this as well if you need to have a look at the Old Testament scriptures that we look at. Vicky and I are also available if anyone wants to talk through anything that comes up from this morning to explore this complex yet exciting passage further. The role of the priest within Israelite religious culture was to be an intermediary between God and humanity. It would be the priests who would offer the daily sacrifices required by the law, as well as the sacrifices from the people, including burnt, grain, peace, and sin offerings, found in Leviticus chapters 1 to 7. Amongst the priests, there would be the high priest, who would once a year, every year, on the Day of Atonement, enter into the most holy place, the very presence of God, in the tabernacle or temple, to offer sacrifices to cleanse himself, the people, and the tabernacle or temple of sin, so that God could dwell with his people. Information about the Day of Atonement is found in Leviticus chapter 16. The writer of Hebrews introduces Jesus as a high priest figure for all believers in earlier chapters of the letter, and returns to it in our passage today. We see that Jesus entered the perfect heavenly tabernacle to offer sacrifice to cleanse all people. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is very much seen as a continuation of the Day of Atonement rituals seen in Leviticus. The only difference between the high priests of the past and present and Jesus is the effectiveness of the sacrifice. As I've already mentioned, the high priest would have had to offer these sacrifices once a year, every year, so that God's people could be cleansed. However, later in chapter 9 and the rest of Hebrews, we see that the sacrifice Jesus offered was once for all time, found in chapter 9, verse 26. The cleansing of sin Jesus offers to everyone is something that doesn't need topping up or renewing. Jesus has already done all that is needed for salvation to occur. As we have seen so far, the cleansing that Jesus offers is greater because of the once for all time nature of it. However, it is also greater in the way it cleanses. The writer of Hebrews refers to one specific cleansing ritual to contrast it with Jesus' cleansing in verses 13 and 14. This reference is the ashes of a heifer, which cleanses an individual from ceremonial impurity, found in Numbers chapter 19, so that they can engage in acts of worship of God. One example of this is that if someone were to come into contact with a deceased human, found in Numbers 19, verses 11 to 13, the individual would become ceremoniously unclean. and would need the purification waters mentioned throughout this chapter to be purified. The water would have purified the ritual impurity, but wouldn't cleanse the individual of sin, as a Day of Atonement sacrifice was still required yearly. This is compared to the sacrifice of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which completely cleanses all who are eagerly waiting for him. Jesus' sacrifice not only offers purification, but total cleansing of our entire being, once and for all. This way of thinking invites those who accept and believe Jesus' life, death, and resurrection into a new covenantal life, one where the sacrifice for sin is already complete, and we enter into a life of love and worship in the very presence of God. Jesus is seen in Hebrews chapter 9 verse 15 as the mediator of this new covenantal way of life with God. Jesus, who is part of the Godhead, is the person who is the go-between for humanity and God. Through his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus removed the barriers between humanity and God. Therefore, God dwells with us, and we can dwell with God. The mediator of a covenant is someone who works as the sealer. They ratify the agreement made between two parties. Jesus, through his sacrifice, creates a covenant that is based on grace through the cross and the following resurrection. The cleansing is offered once for all time, and we can enjoy a life that is free from the penalty of sin, because Jesus has already dealt with it. God offers us life as we offer him ourselves in submission and belief. It is through Jesus that we can enter this covenant life. He mediates this covenant and intercedes before the Father on our behalf, found in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 25. As Jesus is the mediator, through our faith and belief, we are made right before God and can receive the eternal inheritance that chapter 9 verse 15 in Hebrews speaks of. And God offers this. All we need to do is accept the offer of covenant that Jesus lays before each one of us as individuals. These three statements can be confusing, but it explains through Jewish law imagery how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection has an impact on the salvation we receive through our faith. Through my faith and through your faith, we are saved from the penalty of sin, which is spiritual death. Through my faith and through your faith, we are cleansed from our mistakes, our self-service, and sin, so that we can live in the very presence of God and God with us. Through salvation, we are purified so that we can worship the living God, which is mentioned in Hebrews 9, verse 14. All of this is so that we can live a life of worship towards God. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the old school Salvation Army phrase, saved to serve, and how it was relevant for today. However, today I want to suggest that we adapt this to saved to worship. Our service of God is required, yes, but it needs to be done in the attitude of worship. Vicky, in our student Bible study this week, paraphrased Jesus' call to come and follow me as come and live life like I do, highlighting Jesus' want for people to follow the spirit of the law, which is living a life of overflowing devotion and worship towards God, and letting this worship impact our everyday living. This living a life of worship is not a walk down the street singing worship songs at people like you're in some strange Christian musical. Worship songs, hymns, set prayers are helpful in our personal devotion towards God, but that is not what he requires for our everyday interactions of God worship with people and situations we encounter. Amos reminds God's people that God wants to see a mighty flood of justice, an endless river of righteous living, which is found in Amos chapter 5, verse 24. Micah, another prophet, states to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, found in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. These are two small examples from many within the Bible that speak of our acts of worship, including speaking out against and acting to remove injustice, giving total love and value to everyone we encounter, and to do all of this for the glory of God alone. My questions for you and for me today are you prepared to recommit to or enter for the first time into this gracious and amazing covenant Jesus offers? How are you letting this covenantal way of life affect your living? Are there injustices you notice that you need to speak out against? Do you know people who need to be told or reminded that they are loved and valued by us and by, more importantly, God? What will you do about this? And finally, are you living as if you're saved to worship?